July of 1969. In a control room in Moscow, the lights are low, the windows are covered by thick curtains, and only the screens illuminate the faces of the engineers. On one of them, the images arrive with seconds of delay. An American astronaut descends the ladder of a module resting on a sea of gray dust. The voice of a foreign announcer, distant and metallic, proclaims the words the entire world will remember. The air in the room is dense, no one applauds, no one speaks. The men and women filling that room know what they're seeing. The flag rising on the lunar surface is not theirs. On the back wall, above a wooden molding, hangs a black and white portrait, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the engineer who taught them to look up. He had died 3 years earlier without seeing this image. The cameras show Neil Armstrong taking slow steps on the moon. Soviet broadcasts do not replay it live. They barely mention it in a bulletin. But in the offices of the space program, in the laboratories, in the tracking stations, everyone is watching. Every bootfall on the lunar dust sounds like a distant echo in the pride of those who began the race. An engineer breaks the silence. His voice is low, barely a sigh. They beat us, but we were the first. The others listen without looking at him. On the floor, cigarette butts pile up. Outside, the Russian summer shines over the roofs of Moscow, but inside reigns the winter of defeat. On the tables lie blueprints, folders stamped confidential, photos of failed rockets. In a corner, a television plays in black and white the image no one will ever forget. A flag waving in a place where there is no wind. For more than a decade, the Soviet Union had won every first. The first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk. But this time, the summit belonged to another. And while the images kept coming from the moon, a thought crossed the minds of all who had worked under Korolev's command. How could the country that inaugurated the space age lose the greatest race of all? The answer was not in the lunar dust, nor in the flag, nor even in the rockets. It was in the story that had begun long before, in smoke-filled factories, in improvised laboratories, and in the decisions of men who dreamed faster than their country could keep pace. Because before the defeat, there was a beginning, and that beginning had changed the sky forever. May of 1945. Europe is a map in ruins. Berlin smolders, and the victorious armies advance among the remnants of the Reich, seeking not only trophies, but brains. German scientists have become the most coveted booty of the war. They are not seeking gold or oil, but knowledge, equations, blueprints, ideas. In defeated Germany, the Americans find something more valuable than any document, a group of engineers who had designed the most advanced weapon in the world, the V-2. Those rockets, launched against London and Antwerp, had been the first objects made by humans to reach the edge of space. Their creators called them Vergeltungswaffe, weapons of vengeance. For the Allies, they were the beginning of another era. At the head of the program was Wernher von Braun, a young engineer of polite manners and limitless ambition. In the final days of the Reich, von Braun surrendered voluntarily to the United States Army. He knew that if he fell into Soviet hands, his fate would be a labor camp. If he cooperated with the Americans, he could instead offer them the future. Through Operation Paperclip, more than 1,600 German scientists were secretly moved to the United States. Von Braun and his team settled at Fort Bliss, Texas, and then in Huntsville, Alabama. There they began to reconstruct the V-2 rockets with parts brought from Germany, this time under a different flag. The same engineers who had served Hitler now worked for the Pentagon. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Soviet Union moved its own pieces. Soviet occupation teams dismantled the German factories at Peenemünde and Mittelwerk. They loaded entire rail cars with parts, engines, tools, and transferred hundreds of technicians and mechanics to Soviet territory. What they could not take were the men already captured by the Americans. Moscow had blueprints, loose parts, and fragments of knowledge. What it needed was an architect. That man was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. In 1945, while von Braun was shaking the hands of American officers, Korolev was leaving a Siberian gulag with a gaunt face and teeth broken by beatings. He had been accused of sabotage during Stalin's purges. He spent 6 years designing engines in a labor camp for prisoner scientists. Now, the regime rehabilitated him because it needed him. The contrast could not have been more brutal. A former Nazi, welcomed by Western democracy, worked freely under the Alabama sun. A former prisoner of the Soviet state returned to Moscow to build its salvation. In the following months, both men, without knowing each other, would begin the same task: to turn the weapons of the past into the vehicles of the future. In American hangars, the German V-2s were launched over the New Mexico desert as experiments. In the fields of Kazakhstan, under Stalin's orders, Soviet engineers copied the remains of the captured rockets and transformed them into something new: the R-1, the first Soviet replica of a V-2. 2 different paths, one same sky. Von Braun dreamed of reaching the moon. Korolev dreamed of proving that the Soviet Union could do it first. Between them, space became the new battlefield. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union was a country still counting its scars. Cities destroyed by the war rose slowly, factories worked at half speed, and millions of peasants awaited bread before promises. In the midst of that reconstruction, a man asked for resources to launch rockets into the sky. To many, it sounded like madness. Sergei Korolev worked from an improvised laboratory near Moscow, surrounded by young engineers, old tools, and blueprints full of corrections. The state had rehabilitated him, but never fully freed him. He was a valuable specialist, watched by the KGB, dependent on the whims of ministers and the patience of the party. Every screw he requested had to be justified with reports, every mistake explained as if it were treason. When he presented his first design for a long-range rocket, a minister asked him with a cynical smile, "What good is it to reach space if there is no bread on Earth?" Korolev did not answer. He replied with deeds. For years, he worked in secret on a new kind of vehicle, the R-7 Semyorka, a missile 30 meters tall with a range of more than 8,000 kilometers. In theory, it was meant to carry a nuclear warhead. In practice, it was something more, a rocket capable of leaving the atmosphere. No nation in the world possessed such an engine. Not even the Americans, with all their resources, had achieved anything like it. The first launch failed. The second also. But the third flew. In 1957, the R-7 lifted off from Baikonur and streaked across the sky of Central Asia like a bolt of fire. It was the world's first operational intercontinental ballistic missile. The Kremlin celebrated it in secret. For official propaganda, it did not exist. The priority was not knowledge, but deterrence. But Korolev had another idea. While the bureaucrats spoke of military power, he saw a vehicle for something entirely different. "With this rocket," he said one night, pointing to the plan spread out on his table, "we could send something other than a bomb." His collaborators looked at him without understanding. Korolev was not talking about weapons. He was talking about space. The obstacle was not technical, but political. In a country where individual initiative was punished as much as incompetence, proposing something without military utility was dangerous. The state feared failure as much as audacity. Even so, he pushed ahead. He used funds destined for missile development to build a modified version of the R-7. He did not inform the ministers, not even the Central Committee itself. He presented the project as an orbital transmission experiment. No one knew the first satellite in history was being prepared. In the corridors of power, some called him visionary, others lunatic. In his personal notebooks, Korolev wrote a single sentence: "If we manage to put an object in orbit, everything will be possible." The engineer who had survived a gulag, hunger, and suspicion was about to fulfill his most improbable dream, and with it, he was going to change the balance of the world. October 4th, 1957. Night falls over the steppes of Kazakhstan. The air is still, and on the horizon rises a column of smoke shining, with a bluish glow. At the Baikonur Cosmodrome, a small group of engineers watches in silence. There are no flags, no anthems, no crowds. Only a rocket, tall and slender, held by a metal framework. At its tip travels a polished aluminum sphere, 58 centimeters in diameter, with 4 antennas that look like insect tendrils. It weighs less than 90 kilos, and it is about to change history. At 22:28 Moscow time, The engines of the modified R-7 roar with a deep, almost animal sound. The ground trembles. Flames light the plane, and for an instant, the world seems to hold its breath. Then, the rocket rises slowly, gains speed, and disappears into the darkness. No one on Earth can see it, but everyone, without knowing it, is about to hear it. In the improvised control room, the radar screens begin to trace a faint line. Voices cross in Russian. Stage 1, separation confirmed. Altitude, 150 kilometers. Speed, stable. And then, a pause. Silence. Until a faint repetitive sound cuts through the radio receiver. Beep, beep, beep. The communications engineer turns to Korolev. "It's only a sphere," he says, almost without emotion, trying to hide the tension. Korolev smiles for the first time in a long while. "No. It is the beginning of everything." The small satellite, called Sputnik 1, completes a full lap around Earth in 96 minutes. Each orbit is a metallic heartbeat crossing the sky. Its signal can be picked up by any radio amateur on the planet. It does not transmit secret data nor propaganda messages. Only a uniform, constant pulse that says one thing: humanity is here. Within hours, the entire world hears it. In American universities, students gather at night to listen to Sputnik's beeps. At military bases, radars track it with unease. Washington newspapers announce the news with a mix of astonishment and fear. Russians launch satellite into space, first victory in the new race of the century. In Moscow, the reaction is more restrained. The Kremlin takes days to grasp what Korolev has achieved. The satellite was built in secret without formal approval from the Central Committee. The news catches the politicians by surprise, but the propaganda impact is immediate. Space, until then a dream, becomes Soviet terrain. The United States wakes with a start. The nation that had believed it dominated science and technology finds itself looking up, helplessly following a signal crossing its own sky. Newspapers speak of a Sputnik crisis, of vulnerability, of fear. If the Soviets can launch a satellite, they can also launch a bomb. But for Korolev, the meaning is different. It is not a military triumph, but a human gesture. His obsession with looking beyond the atmosphere has been vindicated. On the map of Earth, countries are separated by borders. In space, there are no limits. That small metallic object, the size of a beach ball, carried no cameras or complex instruments, only a transmitter and an idea. It was the planet's first voice speaking to the cosmos. At Baikonur, while the other engineers celebrate in hushed tones, Korolev remains staring at the monitors in silence. He knows he has opened a door no one will be able to close. For the first time in history, space has an owner, and the owner is the Soviet Union. Sputnik had crossed the sky for 3 months before falling into the atmosphere and disintegrating, but its echo did not fade. In Washington, the waves of that metallic beep, beep, beep turned into a national alarm. For the first time, the United States found itself behind. Newspapers spoke of a new era of fear, and in schools, children learned to hide under desks against a possible nuclear attack coming from the sky. President Dwight Eisenhower tried to calm the population, but in the Pentagon, they knew the situation was serious. If the Soviet Union could place a satellite over U.S. territory, it could also place a nuclear warhead. Space was no longer a romantic void. It had become the new frontier of war. In response, Congress approved the creation of NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, in July of 1958. The United States had officially entered the race. It was an implicit admission of defeat and a promise of revenge. In Moscow, the reaction was immediate. They could not allow the enemy to regain the initiative. Korolev received a new order from the Kremlin. Another first as soon as possible. The engineer knew that meant risk. The next step was to place a living being in orbit, not for science, but for propaganda. It had to be shown that an organism could survive outside Earth. The deadlines were impossible. Less than a month. Korolev protested, but the answer was curt. The party does not wait, comrade. Moscow's laboratories filled with cages. Several stray female dogs were chosen, trained with military discipline to withstand acceleration and confinement. The chosen one was named Laika, a mixed breed with a serene gaze who did not know what story she was about to enter. Sputnik 2 was assembled in haste. The rocket had structural defects, the thermal systems were untested, and the capsule barely had ventilation. Korolev knew there would be no possible return. He concealed it from his younger engineers. On November 3, 1957, the rocket lifted off in Baikonur's icy winds. Laika was the first living being to leave Earth. Her heart beat 3 times per second when the rocket reached orbit. In the control room, the engineers listened to the beats transmitted by telemetry. It was the sound of life traveling through space. During the first hours, the signal remained stable. Then, the indicators showed a rise in temperature. The cooling system had failed. The capsule became a metal oven. Laika died a few hours after launch. The official report never mentioned it. Soviet newspapers announced the USSR's mission's resounding success. Propaganda spoke of the first living being in orbit and of the Soviet dog's fidelity to the cause of progress. No one outside the engineers' circle knew the truth. In the streets of Moscow, children looked up saying they could hear Laika's heartbeat from the stars. Exhausted, Korolev smoked in silence before a window at the institute. He knew that victory had the highest price. The machine had worked, but the ideal had been stained. One of his aides broke the silence. "Commander, we did it. The USSR is first again." Korolev exhaled smoke and replied, "There is no victory if it does not return." But the system did not want truths, it wanted triumphs. In the Soviet Union, glory weighed more than life. And while the newspapers proclaimed the power of cosmic socialism, in Korolev's offices, reality exacted its price in silence. April 12, 1961. Dawn over Baikonur has the color of steel. On platform number 1, the Vostok K rocket rises over a cloud of vapor, its surface coated with frost. High up, inside a spherical capsule barely 2.5 meters across, a young man with a round face and easy smile awaits the countdown. His name is Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. He is 27 years old and the son of peasants. His uniform bears the color of Soviet aviation, but his fate is about to transcend any flag. The loudspeaker from the command center booms with the last seconds. Gagarin tightens the straps, breathes deep, and lets out a nervous laugh. When the clock reads 9:07, the rocket's roar shakes the plane. Amid the thunder, his voice rings out by radio, clear and cheerful. "Poyakali! Let's go!" Vostok rises, pierces the atmosphere, and becomes a spark crossing the sky. 89 minutes later, Gagarin becomes the first human to orbit Earth. From his small window, he sees the planet as no man ever had, blue, immense, and silent. "How beautiful," he manages to say, and the phrase is recorded forever in history. In the control room, Korolev listens to the telemetry reports. He does not smile at first. Too many possible failures, too many things that can go wrong. But when he receives confirmation that the craft has reached the planned orbit, his lips curve for the first time in years. The engineers embrace, some weep. The Soviet Union has conquered the sky. Gagarin completes a full lap around the planet. He overflies Africa, the Pacific, Siberia, and when the capsule begins its descent, the automatic re-entry system activates late. For several minutes, contact is lost. In the bunker, the technicians hold their breath. The automatic landing plan fails, and Gagarin is forced to eject at 7,000 meters. He comes down by parachute over a field near the Volga. A peasant woman and her granddaughter see him descend. She screams, frightened, at the man encased in an orange suit with a helmet. "Do not be afraid," he says as he removes the helmet. "I am Soviet. I have come from space." Minutes later, radios across the world repeat his name. In Washington, the news lands like a blow. The Soviet Union has done it first again. In Moscow, newspapers print special editions. Gagarin becomes an instant symbol, the son of the people who touched the stars. But behind the euphoria, Korolev knows how close they came to disaster. The capsule did not land, as propaganda would say. The pilot abandoned it to save his life. The control system veered, instruments failed, communication broke down. Nothing had gone exactly as planned. But the world did not need to know. That very night, the Central Committee drafted the official communiques. There are no errors, no risks, no failures, only triumph. The flight is presented as perfect, exemplary, inevitable. Gagarin smiles in photos, raises his hand to the crowd in Red Square. Korolev, in the background, watches in silence. For him, the feat is not an end, but a warning. He knows the line between success and tragedy is as thin as the atmosphere surrounding Earth. But in the Soviet Union, there is no room for nuance. Glory must be absolute, or it does not exist. Gagarin becomes the face of the century. Korolev, his shadow. Official history will not tell that the hero almost did not return, nor that the system failed, nor that the craft was as uncontrollable as the pride of the country that built it. Glory admits no shades. But the man who uttered Poyakali had just shown that humanity could leave its cradle. And the engineer who made it possible knew that in doing so, they had just begun a new kind of war. The war for the sky. June 16, 1963. Dawn over Baikonur has the color of dust and gasoline. On platform number 5, a Vostok 6 capsule awaits liftoff. Inside it, a 26-year-old woman checks the controls with clumsy movements. The pressure suit limits every gesture. Her breathing resounds like an echo inside the helmet. Her name is Valentina Tereshkova, a textile worker and amateur parachutist. In a few hours, she will become the first woman in space. The entire country is watching her. The Soviet press has prepared the story before liftoff. The daughter of the people, the seamstress who defied the stars, the proof that socialism has no gender limits. The mission has become a political act more than a scientific one. For the Kremlin, it is the definitive answer to American propaganda. While capitalism keeps women on Earth, communism sends them to the sky. At 9:29, the engines ignite. The rocket lifts off, piercing the atmosphere amid a deafening roar. In her headphones, the control voice confirms, Vostok 6, nominal flight. Tereshkova reaches orbit and exclaims, "The sky is blue. How beautiful the planet is." In the command room, Korolev breathes easier. Again, the Soviet Union is first, but the euphoria lasts little. Minutes after reaching orbit, the craft begins to behave erratically. The automatic navigation system is inverted. Instead of descending, the capsule starts a trajectory taking it farther and farther from Earth. Tereshkova, confused, loses orientation. Silence fills the line. "Center, this is Chaika." She uses her codename, Seagull. "I cannot see the horizon. I'm spinning." The signal distorts. The ship spins on its axis, the indicators flicker. Tereshkova feels nauseated, vomits inside the helmet. Her breathing speeds up. Blood pressure rises dangerously. The doctors on the ground demand aborting the mission, but Korolev prevents it. If the craft returns ahead of time, the failure will be public. "There is no withdrawal," he orders. "We will correct the system from here." For nearly an hour, the engineers wrestle with the calculations. Finally, they discover the error. The control program had been inverted by human mistake during configuration. Tereshkova must execute a manual correction, following instructions from the ground. She manages to stabilize the capsule. Disaster is avoided, but the crew will never know it. The official reports will be altered. When the craft lands 2 days later, the broadcast shows a perfect landing, an impeccable smile, and a bouquet of flowers. No image reveals that the pilot landed more than 600 kilometers from the planned point, that she lost consciousness during re-entry, and that she was rescued by peasants who mistook her for a foreign spy. That night, at the Space Research Institute, a journalist asks Korolev if the mission was a success. He merely lights a cigarette and answers, "As long as the party smiles, everything will have gone well." Propaganda turned Valentina into a global icon. On posters, her face appeared alongside those of Lenin and Gagarin. The Soviet woman had conquered the cosmos. But inside the Soviet Union, her spacefaring career ended there. She would not fly again. The state turned her into a symbol, and symbols must not be risked. Korolev knew the flight had been seconds from disaster, but he kept it quiet. His team understood the tacit rule. Failures are not told, heroes do not hesitate, truth does not exist without political utility. History would remember Tereshkova as the first woman in space. Reality, as so often, would remain filed under the word classified. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet space race began to devour itself. What had begun as a shared enterprise, driven by one man's vision, turned into a maze of competing interests. Each factory fought for contracts. Each design bureau wanted to be first to show results. Orders multiplied, reports contradicted each other, and politics, ever present, seeped into every calculation. At the heart of it all was Sergei Korolev, no longer the anonymous engineer of the early years. For the Kremlin, he was the chief designer, an almost mythical figure, but his name remained a state secret. Only a handful of top officials knew who the man behind Sputnik and Vostok really was. In Soviet newspapers, his existence was described with euphemisms, a team of scientists under the direction of a principal designer. Neither his face nor his voice appeared in public. He was an invisible hero. But inside the laboratories, his body was beginning to fail. Years of stress, cigarettes, and silences had left him with an ulcer he could no longer conceal. In the winter of 1966, doctors insisted on operating. It was a routine surgery, they said. It was not. Korolev died on the operating table, officially of cardiac complications. His funeral was conducted with honors, but without a name. The public did not know whom they were burying. With his death, the Soviet space program lost more than its leader. It lost its compass. Korolev had been the only one capable of holding the bureaucrats at bay, mediating among rival designers, imposing order on a system that worked only by the force of his will. Without him, the machinery fractured into factions. The design bureaus, known by their initials, OKB-1, OKB-52, OKB-456, turned into warring fiefdoms. Engineer Vladimir Chelomey sought to replace Korolev's legacy with his own rocket, the UR-500, while Valentin Glushko, the engine designer, blocked rival projects with safety reports and political favors. In every ministerial meeting, technical discussions became personal accusations. In parallel, the ministers of the State Committee for Science and Technology demanded impossible results. A space station, a crewed mission to the moon, a new kind of rocket, all at the same time, with the same resources. Engineers calculated orbits, politicians calculated headlines. The result was a civil war of sorts. No project had continuity. Each partial success was announced as definitive. Each failure was buried under mountains of paper. Soyuz rockets flew, but failed in critical tests. New lunar modules were designed on never-tested plans. The Soviet Union kept winning headlines: the first spacewalk, the first probe to reach Venus, the first craft to orbit the moon. But inside, the system was falling apart. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the United States learned from its mistakes. The Apollo program advanced with an almost unlimited budget and unified leadership. After the Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts, NASA was restructured with implacable discipline. By 1967, the Americans already had a clear goal and a date etched in stone: reach the moon before the end of the decade. In Moscow, there were no dates, only orders. Without Korolev, the Soviet space race turned into a succession of propagandistic victories and silent defeats. Engineers looked at the plans and wondered whether they were still building rockets or monuments. The Soviet Union kept winning headlines, yes, but the cohesion that had carried it to the sky was beginning to disintegrate on the ground. By the end of 1968, the sky began to tilt to the American side. Apollo 8 lifted off from Cape Kennedy on a December morning, and 3 days later, 3 American astronauts orbited the moon for the first time in history. From the other side of space, humanity saw its own planet as a blue sphere suspended in darkness. The photograph they sent, Earthrise, the Earth's dawn over the lunar horizon, changed the world's perspective forever. In the offices of Moscow's Institute of Space Technology, Soviet engineers watched the images in silence. No one applauded. No one smiled. They knew what they meant. While television showed American astronauts reading passages from Genesis from lunar orbit, the Soviet program barely kept its own dream standing. Its equivalent project, N1L3, was to be the USSR's answer to Apollo. It was the largest rocket ever built, a 105-meter-tall tower of steel with 30 engines arranged on a base that roared like mechanical thunder. In theory, it could place a crewed craft on the moon. In practice, it was an uncontrollable colossus. The first launch, in February of 1969, lasted only a few seconds. At 68 seconds after liftoff, the control system lost pressure. The rocket began to disintegrate in mid-ascent and fell back onto the Baikonur Cosmodrome, exploding with a power equivalent to a tactical nuclear bomb. The shockwave was felt tens of kilometers away. The control center's windows shattered, flames lit the night sky. The official report spoke of a failed test without detailing the scale of the disaster. The second attempt, months later, met the same fate. The third did not even lift off. The fourth, in 1972, sealed the end of the Soviet lunar program. In the engineer's room, a man removed his glasses and set them on a table blackened by dust. No one looked at him. He murmured softly, "The rocket did not fail. The country failed." No one replied. Outside, columns of smoke rose over the desert like a metaphor for something deeper, the collapse of a structure that had wanted to reach the sky without fixing what was broken on the ground. The difference between the two sides was no longer technological, but organizational. While NASA worked with unified command, open oversight, and cooperation among universities, contractors, and laboratories, the Soviet system sank in its own secrecy. Decisions were made out of fear, reports were prettified before reaching the Kremlin, and errors were hidden until they became irreparable. Apollo 11 was already being prepared when the last Soviet N1 exploded. And although Moscow denied its existence for decades, American radars detected the explosions. Western intelligence knew the Soviets had tried and failed, but the details remained secret until after the USSR's collapse. When the Americans were preparing to walk on the moon, the Soviets were repairing the walls of their own cosmodrome. Korolev's dream had died a second time, this time not from illness, but from the weight of bureaucracy, fear, and internal competition. On television, Soviet presenters spoke of new automated probes, of scientific priorities, of new objectives. But in the corridors of the space program, everyone knew the truth. The race already had a winner, and they were not the ones who would leave the footprint. July 20th, 1969. Summer in Moscow was warm, but the offices of the Institute of Space Technology were in semi-darkness. The curtains were closed not because of the sun, but out of modesty. In the building's rooms, engineers gathered before imported televisions with flickering black and white images. The broadcast arrived late, intercepted through a foreign signal. On the screen, a man descended slowly down the ladder of the Eagle module. His white suit shone under a light no Soviet had ever seen with their own eyes, the light reflected in lunar dust. When Neil Armstrong set his boot on the surface and uttered his words, "One small step for a man," the whole world held its breath. In Moscow, the silence was absolute. No one applauded, no one shouted. Only the electric hum of the television accompanied the image of the American flag being planted on the moon. In the Kremlin, defeat was not officially acknowledged. Soviet newscasts published a brief, emotionless note on page 6 of Pravda. The American spacecraft Apollo 11 has landed on the lunar surface. The exploration of the cosmos continues to be a collective enterprise of humanity. It was the language of wounded pride, carefully measured to avoid admitting loss. That same night, a radio announcer, trying to preserve a patriotic tone, said with a forced smile, "The Soviets reached space first, the Americans reached their stage set." But in the Institute's corridors, no one laughed. The men who had launched Sputnik, who had watched Gagarin orbit Earth, who had sent the first rocket with a living being, knew exactly what they were seeing: the end of their era. For years they had worked endless shifts, slept on blueprints, hand-welded parts, deceived bureaucrats, and concealed errors to keep alive the illusion of superiority. Now, before that blurry image of a flag waving without wind, they understood that it was all over. One of the senior engineers, his voice breaking, murmured, "We taught the world to fly, and they learned to land." The phrase did not appear in any newspaper, but it was repeated in Baikonur's hallways and Moscow's laboratories. The USSR had won the beginnings, the first satellite, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk. But the moon, the goal that condensed all human dreams, now belonged to the others. Korolev had been dead for 3 years, and his portrait hung on the wall like a cruel reminder. The man who had imagined the road to the cosmos did not live to see it fulfilled. The engineers lit a cigarette before his photo, in silence. No one proposed a toast. That night, while American television showed Armstrong and Aldrin collecting rock samples and deploying instruments, Soviet radio broadcast classical music. No channel spoke of defeat, no headline uttered the word moon with sadness. But everyone knew. They had lost the moon. And with it, the future they had dreamed of building. The moon already had footprints, but not Soviet ones. Even so, in defeat, the Soviet Union kept something no one could take, the legacy of the firsts, Sputnik, Gagarin, Tereshkova, 3 names that had changed history before lunar dust rose under another's feet. At the beginning of the 1970s, the country tried to fill the void with new projects. The direction of the space program changed course. It was no longer about conquering distances, but about remaining. If the Americans had reached the moon, the Soviets would live in space. Thus was born the series of Salyut orbital stations, a floating laboratory where cosmonauts and scientists would learn what it meant to inhabit the sky. The missions were long, quiet, and lonely. Crew members spent entire months orbiting Earth, studying their bodies and minds while the world below barely remembered their names. There were no crowds in Red Square, nor epic broadcasts. Only the routine of work, the hum of machines, the slow pulse of the planet under their feet. Success was no longer measured in firsts, but in endurance, and that endurance became philosophy. While the Americans returned home after each Apollo mission with lunar rocks and headlines, the Soviets built a different kind of victory: permanence. Space was no longer a destination, but a workplace. The Americans explored, the Soviets learned to stay. From that obsession would come the Mir station, the largest orbital laboratory assembled until then. Its name, meaning both peace and world, distilled the program's new spirit. In its modules, techniques of docking, cultivation, repair, and coexistence were tested. It was the promise of a continuous human presence beyond the atmosphere. But behind that silent success, a wound persisted. The lunar program had left a moral void, a sense of defeat that not even 1,000 orbits could erase. The Soviet Union moved on, but with the certainty that it had lost the most visible symbol, the gesture that defined an era. In Baikonur's corridors, some veteran engineers, now gray-haired, spoke with pride of what they had achieved and with melancholy of what was not. "We learned to live up there," said one. "Yes," replied another, "but we never learned to dream that high again." 2 visions of the future had been born of the same fear, the fear of disappearing. The Americans looked outward toward deep space, seeking the unknown. The Soviets looked inward, toward orbit, seeking stability. Exploration versus permanence, both answers to the same vertigo. And although the moon kept the footprints of the others, the near sky, the everyday frontier, the one of constant effort, kept a Russian accent. Because if the Americans conquered distance, the Soviets conquered habit. July of 1975. In a low Earth orbit, 2 spacecraft approach slowly. One bears the flag of the United States, the other that of the Soviet Union. The maneuvers are precise, millimetric, silent. The thrusters cut off, the docking rings align, and a metallic click resounds in the void. The Apollo and Soyuz capsules have just joined. For the first time, the men who represented 2 opposing worlds share the same air. Inside the module, American Commander Thomas Stafford and Soviet cosmonaut Alexei Leonov look at each other before opening the hatches. They have trained for months, learned fragments of each other's language, and now suspended above the invisible border between the two hemispheres. They extend their hands. The greeting is firm, restrained, historic. A camera records everything, and on the world's screens, the image repeats again and again. Two nations that had competed for the sky shake hands in it. Inside Soyuz, someone murmurs, barely audible over the microphones, "We have lost the race, but not the memory." The phrase hangs on the radio, and no one answers. There is no need. Outside, Earth turns slowly beneath them, blue and fragile, the same for all. For the first time in 2 decades, the sky is shared. During the broadcast, the control voices of Houston and Moscow mix on the same channel. Signals once coded for espionage now carry words of courtesy. In the Soviet Union, newspapers call it the symbol of space peace. In the United States, the end of the race. But for the men floating in that joint capsule, there is neither victory nor defeat. Only the evidence that both had looked up for too long without seeing each other. The Soviet Union had won all the beginnings, the first satellite, the first man, the first woman, the first walk. But it lost the moon. History will remember it for that paradox. It won the impulse, it lost the goal, because its ambition ran faster than its truth. Korolev had dreamed of the cosmos, but his country understood only propaganda. Where he saw science, the state saw symbols. Where he saw exploration, the party saw power. His dream was universal, his context limited. The flag that waved on the moon was American, but the spark that lit it had been born in a Soviet factory, in blueprints drawn by a former prisoner who believed in the sky more than in his government. Space is not conquered with missiles or flags. It is conquered with persistence, with the will to look beyond fear. Decades later, Soviet capsules would keep lifting off from Baikonur, American astronauts would keep docking with Russian craft, and orbital stations would keep circling. A planet that learned too late that its sky was one. The USSR disappeared, but its trace remained etched in space. Every mission, every orbit, every photograph of Earth's blue carries some of its shadow. Because although the flag on the moon was American, the spark that lit it was Soviet.